Your pastor is amazing. And I think I remembered it was Christmas that I ran into this church. Yeah, you guys had the hot chocolate and everything. We moved to Idaho 2 years ago. I escaped to Idaho as a political and religious refugee from California, otherwise known as California. Well, what happened was that I got blacklisted. I was been working there for about 40 years, 38 to be exact, and I'd started 4 companies. If you want to know what I did, one of the things I did is, you ever buy a TV that says Dolby Vision? I'm the hardware architect, the chief architect for Dolby Vision on the hardware side. So I'd done a bunch of stuff, and then suddenly I found out that I couldn't get a job anymore. I guess they Googled me, and they didn't like what I was saying. I wasn't woke enough, I guess. But so anyway, so we came here, and I guess it was around Christmas. I now remember, last service, I couldn't remember when it was. We were walking down the street. We saw the parade and everything, and then we saw this church the doors were open, and they had hot chocolates. Of course, our kids are like, oh, hot chocolate, let's go in there. So we come inside, and the first thing I see is a flyer for Charlie Kirk or TPUSA. And I'm like, this is the kind of church I want to meet the pastor. And I didn't get to meet Pastor Mark until about a few months later when Pastor Marty Yost introduced us. But I just want to tell you, this is the kind of church that I talk about in this book, and I'll explain that to you. So thank you, Pastor. Thank you for inviting me. I don't think I'm going to tell you anything you don't know because I'm preaching to the choir. So whatever I say, I want you to remember it and pass it on to your family and your friends who don't agree necessarily with what I'm about to say. And we even have a flyer out there. It's free. Grab 1, grab 5, give it to your friends. And if you go to another church, give it to your pastor, the other church. So as we start, let me start with a quick question. Do you have constitutional rights? Let me ask you another question. Where did the United States get the idea for a constitutional republic? Was it the Greeks? Was it the Romans? Was it the Sumerians? Where did it come from? Who came up with the original idea for a republic versus a democracy? I want you to think through that. A few years ago, I wrote this book called Jesus is Involved in Politics. Why aren't you? Why isn't your church? A lot of pastors. I lost a lot of pastor friends as a result of that. I mean, I didn't lose them, but they were like, hey, I don't know if I'll invite you to speak at my church. But let me explain why I wrote these books. I was born at a very early age in Ghana. Now, I know you're thinking that's a town in Texas. It isn't. It's a country off the west coast of Africa. My parents were actually Christian Indians. St. Thomas came to India in 51 AD, and he converted a bunch of pagans there, and my family dates its ancestry back to that time. And then what's interesting, though, is that even though my grandparents and my ancestry was Christian, and our family attends something called the Mar Thoma Church, the Church of St. Thomas. But what was interesting about this is that my dad and his generation were all communists and atheists. In fact, my dad was a Marxist until he met the Lord when I was about 5. And some of my cousins my uncles were very famous atheists. Very famous communists. One was actually on the run from Nehru, who was a socialist. Socialists don't like communists, but they're the same thing. We'll see in a minute. But anyway, so as a result of this, I was born in Ghana, but then grew up in Jamaica, Ethiopia, India, Yemen, and Sudan. And I know when I say Sudan, you're like, well, Neil, Sudan, that's a town in Texas. You're absolutely correct. There it is, off Highway 84. Just past the Dairy Queen. But that's not the Sudan I grew up in. The Sudan I grew up in is a country on the east coast of Africa where they speak Arabic. And I actually spoke a pretty decent Arabic, street Arabic, but forgot it all once I came here at the age of 18 and started watching Star Trek in English. Now, you're probably wondering why I travel so much. Was I a spy or a terrorist? I look like one when I grow a beard. My wife says I'm not allowed to grow a beard because I look like a terrorist. But hey, it is true. A pretty good-looking terrorist, if you ask me. But hey. But I mean, if you think about it, Sudan and Yemen are both hotbeds of terrorism. But it wasn't that. My dad was a professor of physics. And he taught at universities all over the world. And actually, he came to the Lord through physics. We always asked my mom, because my mom was a Christian, we're like, why did you even marry Dad? You wouldn't let us marry non-Christians. And she didn't have an answer, so anyway. But I tell you all this to introduce you to a story of when I first tried to come to the United States. My father was a professor at the University of Sana'a in Yemen. Yemen is a country that has Sharia law. Women wore burqas. And Dad had worked there for about 6 years and planned to work a bit longer there. I was about 18 years old, and I knew there had to be more to women than this. And I decided I wanted to come to America to go to college because the United States was the land of my destiny. It was the land of prosperity, but mainly it was the land of very, very beautiful women. And so I decided I needed to come here and find the most beautiful woman, and I did, and I convinced her to marry me, and there she is. Those are not our kids. Those are the flower girls. Now, a professor's pay in Yemen was not sufficient to pay school and board and tuition in the United States, and it's probably even less so now. But my parents figured that if they used their savings and sacrificed, they could send me to school in America as long as Dad continued to work for the government of Yemen and making the same salary. So we made our plans. I actually got admitted to Oregon State University as a Beaver. But I remember the first time I tried to come here, back in those days we didn't have the internet. We had something called telex. We didn't even have fax. It was a telex, the machine. And so we got everything set up through telex, and I got admitted and all that. But 2 months before I was supposed to leave, my dad came home from work one day, and he sat us all down. And he told us that his contract with the government and the university had been terminated. You see, we found out that a fellow professor had committed suicide. And when the police went into his house, they found on his nightstand a Bible with my father's name on it. The penalty for preaching the gospel to a Muslim in a Sharia law country is death. Well, my dad had students who had graduated from his university and become involved in politics, and so they came to him that night and they said, look, we can give you 2 weeks before the mullahs come. And next week, we need you to go to a safe house. We'll set up a safe house for you. My dad called the American ambassador, whom we knew, and he said, no, we'll put you in our safe house. So they put him under Marine Guard in one of their safe houses. But in effect, my dad was telling me that because a fellow worker had a Bible from him, we had to leave the country. And my dreams of coming to America were shattered. Why? Because it is illegal to give someone who is not a Christian a Bible in the Yemen Arab Republic. You see, in Islamic countries, you don't have any unalienable rights. You certainly don't have the right to talk about religion or politics to a Muslim, and you don't have the right to give a Muslim a Bible. So where did these rights come from? In Yemen, the government thinks they grant you your rights. The right to talk to others about your religion is not one of the rights that they grant you. I used to talk to folks that thought that this would never happen in America. I mean, I would say, look, this is, and I wrote my book in 2009, and I said, this is something that you guys need to watch out for. And like, God, Neil, this is America. And then COVID happened. And I don't need to spend 5 minutes talking about it, but I do want to tell you what happened to our church. You see, I used to go in San Jose, we went to the finest church in America. You go, fine? Yeah, because we had $4 million in fines. Because actually, I was going to a different church, a large church, about 4,000, and then they shut down for COVID because the government said, it's not safe for you to shut down. Now, let me ask you this. While they were writing the Bill of Rights, did the Founding Fathers say, oh, you know what, the First Amendment doesn't apply if there's a pandemic? Because first of all, King George would have said, oh, let's declare a pandemic. And second, there was a pandemic. It was called smallpox. How do we think that the First Amendment doesn't apply? But I don't need the First Amendment, as I'm going to show you in just a minute. But the thing is that we have seen that. Our church refused to shut down, so our pastor, they only had about 250 people there. So we moved to that church, and I sent out an email on the VAC mailing list. All the pastors in San Jose hate me now. I said, come to a real church, not to an electronic church. And that church grew from 250 to 3,000 in 8 months. Right? And we started having these VAC meetings. The pastor came and says, you know your VAC meetings that you had to shut down because you're holding at a different church? I said, yeah. He said, you got to do it here. So we started having it, and it started growing. At one point, we had 1,800 people because that was a big church. They only had 250 people when we started, but now they had 3,000. We had 1,800 people coming to our meetings, VAC meetings, to learn about things about freedoms. So, here is how you can get involved in the VAC. I'll put this up at the end, but I want you to know at the end of this talk, as I said, I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but I want you to have these tools, and I want you to help us in that. So let me also give you another thing. My real passion is to preach the gospel. And my second passion is to teach apologetics, which allows you to preach the gospel. But let me explain what apologetics is. Apologetics is proving Christianity is true using facts, logic, reason, history, and archaeology. Right? So if somebody says, why should I be a Christian? Because it's true. Here's the evidence. Here's the scientific evidence for it. Now, the problem is that 75% of most of kids who go to college leave the faith. Why? Because they get talked out of it by their professors. You need to immunize them. And so we think the only people who can do that are parents. And so we wrote this book. I wrote this book with my two younger kids. They were 7 and 9 at the time. It's designed for 6-year-olds to 12-year-olds. It's a daily apology for kids, and you can take a look at it back there. But it's very important because only you can stop your kids. Let me give you a brief example here. The pastor said I could speak longer this service. And I was talking to Dee Dee, and she said, what happened to the 2-hour sermon? So I take that as a symbol that I can go for 2 hours here. But really, if you think about it, let's say that your kid had a disease and 75% of your kids, 75% of the kids who got that disease died. Would you just send your kid off to the hospital and say, okay, doctors, you take care of it? Or would you become the expert in the disease? Would you go on the internet and find out all the pros and all the cons of every treatment? And every time the doctor suggested something, you'd be saying, well, let me check that out. Let me see what that is. Let's try this. Let's try that. Well, you need to be the expert in the disease of the worldliness that your kids are going to be facing. Okay. Let me ask you this question. Back to our topic. Do our rights come from government? No, you all know they don't come from government. What would happen if our rights came from government? As you've seen in this very state, in this county, this governor said that you don't have the right to assemble to worship. He said you don't have the right to assemble to work. He said you don't have the right to assemble to celebrate Christmas or Thanksgiving, as we've seen in different states. You folks, if rights came from government, then government could what? They could legally, ethically, morally, and justly take away those same rights for any made-up reason, like for your safety. It's not safe for you to meet. It's not safe for you to have Bible studies. It's not safe for you to gather together. But it's okay for Costco, for alcoholic selling establishments, for strip clubs. Okay, so rights can't come from government. Can I give myself rights? Can I walk around saying, I'm emperor? You must bow before me. No, I can't, because I don't have any authority. And the emperor who has authority, his only authority is a big stick, right? He'll kill you if you don't bow down before him. So rights can't come from myself because I don't have authority. In fact, I don't even have authority to say that you should treat you equally, because I don't have authority over you. I have authority over my kids, but not over you. So rights can only come from somebody who has an authority to tell you what to do. Well, if I can't get it from myself, can I get it from the masses? Can the masses tell me what to do? This is known as a democracy. Our founding fathers called it a mobocracy, where the mob decides what to do on the passions. And here's now, a lot of people on the left, I'll be talking to them, and they'll say, well, of course, it's a contract that we have. It's a social contract. The masses decide what is true. So I said, well, let me ask you this. If the masses decide not to give me rights, does that mean the masses are ethical and moral not to give me rights? When the Nazis decided to take away the rights from the Jews, was that ethical and moral? That was the masses. That was a democracy. In fact, did you know that prior to the 1800s, every single culture except for the Israelites had no problem with slavery, as long as they were not the slaves? So if rights come from the masses, then the slaves never had rights. They merely got a new set of rights due to the largesse of some nice white folk. But is that true, that the slaves get new rights? Or isn't it true that the slaves always had rights, but these rights were unjustly being violated, and it wasn't until the majority in the state recognized those pre-existing rights that justice was restored? So rights can't come from the masses. So they always had those rights. Where do the rights come from? Well, in reality, rights can only come from somebody who has authority to give you rights. Someone who has the authority to say to Hitler, you got to treat the Jews equally. Tell the Nazis, you better not kill the Jews. To tell the slave owner, you're not allowed to have slaves. To tell anybody, you're not allowed to be racist against anyone because I forbid it, because I made all men equal. Who is the only one that has the authority to do that? See, only someone who has authority over every single human can insist that every single human treat every single other human equally. Make sense? Well, who is that only being? Well, that only being is what? The Creator God. Now, notice how we arrived at that self-evidently. It's logical. I don't need the Bible to explain that, but here's where it becomes more important. Let's look at what the Declaration of Independence thing. You know the thing. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their government, by themselves, by the masses, by a social contract. No, by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, there's a tendency to think that Thomas Jefferson came up with this concept and he was a genius. Now, he was a genius. Let me let you know a little secret. He didn't come up with this concept. This concept was written for 200 years before that by pastors in pulpits just like this, preaching that rights can only come from God because it made sense. See, rights can only come from the Creator. Now, here's why I asked you. Remember that trick question? I said, do you have constitutional rights? My friends, you don't have constitutional rights. I don't mean you lost them. I mean you never had them because the Constitution doesn't give you rights. Look at it. Read it. Read it carefully. It doesn't give you a single right. It presumes that you already have those rights that somebody else gave you that was declared in the Declaration of Independence. There are no rights in the Bill of Rights. It says you are not allowed, the government cannot forbid you to gather. Why? Because it already assumes that right is there. You see, we've gotten the habit of calling constitutional rights. But it's dangerous to call them constitutional rights. It's dangerous to think of them as constitutional rights. It's dangerous to teach them as constitutional rights. Why? Because one day a crazy majority could then simply change the Constitution and take your rights away. Rights don't come from the Constitution, they only come from God. But here's something else we should never forget. You see, I've traveled around the world, and one of the reasons I introduce all of that is to tell you, because I've traveled around the world and I teach apologetics, I've become an expert on most religions. And I can tell you that the Quran does not give you unalienable rights. Hinduism and its 3,000 gods don't give you unalienable rights. Buddhism has no God. It's basically atheism. So you have no authority to give you rights. So therefore, none of those religions give you rights. None of them except for the Bible. The biblical Creator equal unalienable rights. So my friends, if you take the Bible out of the Constitution or out of the government, what do you get? You get no unalienable rights. This is the logical progression. And listen up, atheists, secularists, Hindus, Buddhists, everyone. If you ban Christianity or the Bible for government or the public sphere, you get what? You get tyranny. Okay. So if governments don't give us rights, then what then is the purpose of governments? Why do we need governments? What does the thing say? You know the thing. What does it say? It says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men. So the purpose of government is to protect the rights you already have. That's all it's supposed to do. It's not supposed to do anything else but protect your rights. Now, you know you can't separate politics from lawmaking because that's what politics is all about. And you can't separate lawmaking from morality because it's immoral to violate someone's rights, right? And you can't separate morality from a moral authority. That is the biblical Creator, because none of the other religions give you that. Only the Bible gives you that. And you can't separate the biblical Creator from Christianity and the church. What does that mean? That means you can't separate politics from Christianity and the church. This is so important for you to understand, because if you don't have that, you end up with oppression and tyranny. It's unloving to remove the Creator. It's a biblical Creator that assures us that oppression does not thrive. Only a mean-spirited, ignorant, illogical person would try to remove the biblical Creator from politics. Now, if you're visiting or watching and you're not a Christian, you're like, oh, yeah, see, there he is. It's the Christian nationalism. They want a theocracy. Well, we don't want a theocracy as defined by man. Let me explain why. You see, Presbyterians don't want a Baptist government. Charismatics don't want a Baptist government. Assemblies of God don't want a Baptist government. Harvest Church doesn't want a Baptist government. For crying out loud, Baptists don't want a Baptist government. They're like, have you ever been to the SBC? Oh, my goodness. Folks, we don't want a Christian government. We want Christians in government. We don't want a church government. We want a moral government. And if that is true, which is the source of morality? Where does morality come from? It only comes from God, because he's the objective moral provider, the objective provider of truth, in which case, who is best to have in the world making laws? Who better to instruct the world on moral issues than pastors? Pastors have to be involved in politics, but not just pastors, Christians too. Who's going to instruct a lawmaker that he's doing the wrong thing? Now, what does the Bible say about this? You know, I always say it's very interesting that you have to look at what people think about that. Their theology affects everything. For instance, if you go to the medical professional, and they think that we evolved some accidental way through some, mutation and all that stuff, and they think that everything in our body is accidental. Then when they go look at it, they're like, oh, I wonder why this is there. Why is this appendix there? Why is this there? Where is that there? But compare that to an engineer. Let's say I was trying to fix something. Or let's say I was working on my lawn tractor. And I'm like, oh, I wonder why this gear is there. The guy who put it in had no idea. He must have just thrown a gear in there. I'll just take that gear out. Obviously, I'll be a lot better off fixing that tractor if I go, this guy had a reason for it and a purpose for it, and he was intelligent about it, and it seems to be working, so that's what I should think about. We should do that with our biology. In fact, I think in 100 years from now, we'll look back at the last 200 years of biology and genetics and say, man, we just wasted 200 years because we thought things accidentally evolved. Instead of saying, why is this here? Why is that there? Why is this piece there? Well, it's the same thing when it comes to government. If we think that we have to accidentally evolve some system of government and make laws arbitrary because we don't know what this is, then we're mistaking the whole thing. Let's go back to the original person who designed mankind and designed government. Remember, I asked you, where did we get the idea of the republic for the first time? We got it from Exodus 18. Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, who's now a believer in God, says, you shall select from all the people competent men who reverently fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain. You shall place these over the people as leaders, officials of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and tens. And later on, Deuteronomy shows that the people are supposed to select these people. Now look at that last line, of tens. By the way, you know the book of Judges? It's really not the book of Judges. The word judges there was translated from the Hebrew word rulers. It's the book of rulers. He's talking about the rulers. This is the rulers. Remember in the passage the pastor spoke, the rich young ruler. He's a politician. These were the rulers that were supposed to be appointed. He was obviously a politician of a higher level, but we're supposed to have rulers of tens. That means that every 10th person is supposed to be involved in politics. Look down your row, count 10. If there's not a politician in that row, it's supposed to be you. And if you want to get involved with Dad is here, he'll sign you up to be a precinct committeeman, just like your pastor is. 1 in 10, that's where you start with the 10 and it builds and builds. In fact, Tad and I were just comparing notes once when I spoke before. I said, that's exactly how the U.S. is built up. You've got 1 in 10 and it goes all the way up. You need to get involved. Okay, but what are rights? I mean, I talk to some of my liberal friends, and they go, well, education is a right. Is education all right? Is healthcare all right? They think it is. Well, how do we tell the difference between what is a right and what is not a right? Is having a park a right? Of course, we think freedom of speech, freedom to own property, life, liberty. But those are examples of rights. If somebody throws something at me, how do I know if it's a right or something else? So we're going to play a little game. If you played this game before, you're not allowed to play. I'm going to throw something on the thing, and you tell me if it's a right or something else. As always, there are trick questions here. Is this a right? Some say yes, some say no. I'm sorry, guys, this is a gun. But there is a right associated with it. What is that right? The right to bear arms. You see, you have the right to own a gun, but when you're born, you're not entitled to be given a free gun. You have to buy, make, or earn your own gun. And now with the 3D printers, you can print one. But you still have to buy the material for it. Okay, how about this? Is this a right? Some of you are not sure because I fooled you the first time. Yes, you're right. It is a right. Okay, it is a right. Now, but what about this? This is a printing press. The younger kids have no idea what this is. See, in the old days, we had to fill out brochures. We didn't have the internet. But if you need to have freedom of speech, you have to be able to print them, right? So are you entitled to a printing press? I mean, when you're born, do your neighbors have to go around and force everybody to donate to your personal printing press? Or the community printing press? Is the community forced to give you a printing press? No. Why? Because a printing press is not a right. It's something that allows you to exercise, but it's not a right, it's something else, so the printing press goes. So now you're getting the idea. Look at these. A home ownership, a job, healthcare, food, clothing, education. Are these rights or something else? There is a right in there. Do you see it? Home ownership. Exactly. You have the right to own a home, but you're not entitled to a home when you're born. You got to build your own home. You got to buy your own home. You got to earn the money to buy that home, right? So my question then is, how do you tell the difference between rights and something else? So I'm going to show you how to do that. And any time this comes up, when you're voting for something, you got to say, is this a right or is this something else? Especially if you're in politics, if you're representative. So rights are things that God gives you. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to share the gospel. The something else is what we call goods and services. Goods and services are the product of someone's labor. Anytime something is the product of somebody's labor, it's not a right. It's a good or a service. And it's certainly not God-given. So is education a right? No. Why? Because where are you going to get that education from? You're going to get it from teachers. Well, are the teachers going to give you the education? No. But you'll have to, if you go out there and you corral a bunch of teachers, whip them into slavery, and beat them until they give you an education, then you can get an education, right? For free. Well, how about healthcare? What, do we go out and grab a bunch of doctors and whip them until they provide free healthcare? No, we can't do that. But now what we do is we do corral everybody and beat them until they give us 30% of their income, and then we use that for free healthcare and free education. You see that? You see, as soon as something is a product of somebody else's work, it's not a right. You have a right to your own goods and services, but not to somebody else's, because that's what the Bible calls stealing. Our founders were not idiots. They understood quite well why rights were not goods and why they could not write a constitution that guaranteed goods to anyone unless they were the fruit of your own honest hard work. Notice the difference. The right to bear arms is not a right to be given a free firearm. The right to free speech is not the right to be given a radio station or a free website. If you do get a free website, you're the product. Google is selling you, right? Everything you do is being sold to some advertiser. I mean, to some product seller. Okay, I hope you see there's a the huge difference. If you are voting on something, oh, this is a park. Oh, is that a right or a good? No, that's goods and services. Oh, this is a school bond. Is that a right or a good? No, that's goods and services. You're stealing from one person to force to give something else to others. Notice that the constitutions that give you have a Bill of Rights for education and jobs and healthcare are all communist constitutions. And we've seen how they've worked. See, goods that are granted as rights require you to enslave men fiscally or physically, that's financially or physically, to ensure a continuous supply of the goods that you promise to others. Sadly, today, most Americans don't know the difference. And they think there's a scale between what the government should provide and should not provide. It's quite clear. There's a clear line. Goods and services they're not supposed to provide. Rights they're supposed to protect. That's their only job. I was once at a Republican convention, and Charlie Kirk's organization had a thing that said taxation is theft. And I'm walking through, and a guy running for office, some state, a Republican running for office, says, "You don't really believe that." I said, "Yes, I do." He says, "Well, who's going to pay for the roads?" I said, "Apparently, you need some education." I didn't say that. I thought it. I said, "Look, fees for services that you require is fine. You own a car, you pay a fee to use the road, usually through a gas tax. With electric cars, you got to figure that out, right? You own a house, you pay fees for the sewage. You want fire protection, you pay a fee for the fire protection. You want police protection, you pay a fee for the police protection. You got a bigger car, you pay more because you beat up the road. You got a house that's worth more, you got to pay a bit more because you need to pay a bit more to protect it, right? Because it's bigger, right? That's fees for services. But most of our taxes don't go for fees for services. They go to feed and take care of the poor. They go to provide goods and services for the poor. So, flat tax, low tax, sales tax, that's all theft. The only correct tax is fees for services. And that's not a tax. You see, everything else is socialism. And the Bible refutes socialism. Remember the 7 deadly sins? You can remember them with the acronym WASP-LEG, right? Now look at the two that I've highlighted, avarice and sloth, greed and laziness, right? Oh, and by the way, notice that we just came by Pride Month. One of the 7 deadly sins, right? Now, how does the Bible refute socialism? Because it talks about sin nature. These are the sins that all of us have these are the nature that we all have, that we have to fight against. So the Bible refutes socialism quite simply, because socialism says all men will work as much as they can and take as little as they need. And socialism says, hey, we'll all work as much as we can. But sin nature says not all men will work as much as they can, but all men will work as little as they need and take as much as they can. Greed and laziness. And guess what you get? You get Venezuela. One of the richest countries in the world. They had the most amazing beef and oil. And look at them today. Now somebody says, well, how come you used Venezuela? Why don't you use Sweden? Well, Sweden is if you ask a Swede, are you socialist? They'll say no, but they do have socialist programs. But with their socialist programs, do you know that Sweden is poorer than all but 12 of the United States states? And the United Kingdom, which is fully socialist, is poorer than every single one of our states. I want to talk about socialism, and you guys have seen these guys, right? The anti-fascisti. The anti-fascists, Antifa they call themselves, right? I always like to add this in because you see, in the history of mankind, it's very funny that these fascists are saying, we're anti-fascists, but they're socialists. And whenever I run into them, I said, can you tell me an example of a fascist who wasn't a socialist? And they're like, yeah, Hitler. I'm like, Hitler? Hitler was a national socialist. In fact, every fascist in the history of mankind has also been a socialist. I'm not saying every socialist is a fascist, but every fascist is a socialist. So when they call you a fascist, you go, hey, I'm not a socialist. And to be a fascist, you have to be a socialist, because every single fascist has been a socialist. Saddam Hussein was a Ba'ath Party socialist. Hafiz al-Assad was a Ba'ath Party socialist. Gamal Abdel Nasser, socialist. Gaddafi, remember him? He was a socialist. Idi Amin, the terror of Uganda. Now Uganda is a Christian nation. He was a socialist. And Mussolini, the guy who gave us the name fascism or made it famous, was a socialist. And even going all the way to Caesar. Caesar was a socialist. By the way, have you ever wondered how you pronounce Caesar? The word is pronounced Kaiser. Ever recognize the Kaiser? You know, when they went to Russia, what did it become? Tsar. It's the same word. It's all socialism. Even when you get to the kings and the emperors, it's all socialism. Why? Because you can't have total control unless you promise people free stuff. Socialism, fascism, empires, all tied together because it's all the same idea. And what you do is you promise with fascism, you just promise free stuff to the corporations. Hey, we'll declare an emergency and then you will be able to give people vaccines. And then you'll have billions and billions of dollars of rewards, because the government will pay for it, will print money. But here's the question, though. If we abandon socialism, somebody came up to me and said, Neil, if we abandon socialism, who's going to take care of the poor? And in fact, I had on my webpage, on my Facebook page, somebody posted, well, Jesus said, feed the poor. Jesus was a socialist. So you get this. So here's the question. Should our government, if we need to take care of the poor, shouldn't our government reflect that? So I want to go back to where we learned about taking care of the poor. And it was from the story of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament. And this is the story, the way the story goes, right? If you remember, Jesus says the guy was walking, there was a Good Samaritan walking down the road. He sees a guy got beat up by a bunch of thugs. He takes him to the innkeeper. And we always forget the innkeeper in the story. And the innkeeper, he tells the innkeeper, he says, Mr. Innkeeper, here is half the money. When I come back, because I think we all should share, I want you, Mr. Innkeeper, to pay the other half of the money. You didn't say that? No. You're right. You didn't say that. Good catch. He said, Mr. Innkeeper, here's half of the money. When I come back, I'm going to bring some of my thugs and goons and going to beat up your neighbors and collect money from them, and we're going to pay you the rest of the money. Yeah, that was obviously not true, but this is the real story. Real story said, Jesus said, then the Good Samaritan said to the innkeeper, look, here's half of the money. When I come back, I'm going to bring the IRS, and they're going to tax everybody, and then we'll pay you. No, he said what? I will pay you voluntarily. You see, Jesus said, you give to the poor, not force your neighbor to. See, socialism is nothing more than forcing your neighbor to give to your favorite charity at the point of an IRS agent's gun. You are to take care of the poor. Jesus was saying it's not the state's job to take care of the poor, it's the church's job. And we did that. We did that for 2,000 years. We took care of the poor. In fact, when growing up in Africa and the Middle East, the best hospitals were the Christian hospitals, the missionary hospitals, that were free. They were better than the state-run hospital. Oh, yeah, we were working for the government, so we had free health care from the state, and this was great. I'm telling you, this was great. We would go in to the doctor, and we would call up the doctor and say, hey, we want to come in. And we'd get there, and there'd be 100 people in line before us. And then the aide would come up and say, Dr. Ninen? Yes, you're next. And we'd bypass all 100 people. Why? Because the doctor was an Indian. You see, in free government healthcare, those special people get special preferences, but you schmucks get to wait in line. I was on a radio show once, and this guy, he was a liberal. I never go on liberal radio shows, but my booker said, oh, no, he's a really nice guy. He'll be nice to you. So I go on this show, and it's a liberal show, so I'm kind of antsy about it. And I'm the first guest, and there's 20 minutes. I do the 20 minutes, and then he says, Mr. Mammen, our keyboard's lit up. Everybody wants, our phone banks are lit up. Everybody wants to talk to you. I'm like, yeah, they want to yell at me, which was true. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll stay on. So I take the first few calls, and they're all yelling at me. They're telling me how, all these things about me. But the host is really good. He lets me get the last word, so it's kind of great. And then after the first 20 minutes, he goes, Mr. Mammen, can you stay on for another 20 minutes? And then he said another 20 minutes. And then he said, Mr. Mammen, I'm going to cancel all my guests. Can you stay on for the full 3 hours? So I was on the show for 3 hours, and they were beating me up. They were calling me and beating me up. But I think towards the last part of the show, somebody said, hey, there's a conservative on that show, on that liberal show. We all should call in. So last half of the show, they were all calling and beating up on him. But halfway through the beat up on Neil part, which, by the way, I really enjoyed because I got the last word, this lady calls me up and she says, well, you're mean-spirited and evil. You don't care about the poor. I said, why? She says, well, maybe in Africa, those Christian hospitals are fine. But here in America, this is completely different. In fact, last week, I was at my hospital, and they had the latest MRI equipment, the latest CAT scan. Do you think your church can do that? I said, ma'am, can I ask you a question? She goes, what? I said, what is the name of your hospital? Long silence. So I asked again. I said, ma'am, can you tell us the name of your hospital? Long silence. The host starts cracking up because he knows where this is going. And he says, Madam, will you please tell Mr. Mammen the name of your hospital? And she goes, St. James, but that's not important. I said, ma'am, the reason it's called St. James because Christians started the hospital. The only reason that it is now, we've sold it. They've sold those hospitals to people like St. Satan's and all that stuff. The reason why healthcare is so expensive is because the government got involved. And as Ronald Reagan says, if you want sand to be expensive and impossible to get, then have the government get involved in it. What will the government do? The government say, some guy will come to the government and say, we can't share any sand. We got to have, it's a government sand. That's to be graded. So we got to have a company come in and do it. And so all of a sudden, the company will say, well, we can't have anybody take any sand off the beach. We better make sure it's all controlled. And so they'll put guards and wires around the fence, and they'll say, you can only get government sand through government and price. And the price of sand goes up because what? The government has to pay for all that. You know, government organizations are also 2 to 5, maybe 6 times more expensive than Christian organizations. There was an organization in San Jose that sent me this flyer. It says it takes the city of San Jose almost $60,000 to care for a homeless person. It takes City Team, which was a Christian organization, only $12,000. And guess what? That $12,000 is all raised from donations. And after that $12,000 is spent, the person is off the street. After the $60,000 is spent, the person is back on the street again to spend that again and again and again when the government does it. You see, this is why socialism doesn't work, and it's unloving to let the government continue to be in the business of charity when we could help 2 to 5 times the number of needy people with the same amount of money. But we can't get there overnight. People will be dying in the streets. The church must first take back its leadership and resume its proper role. I was saying this once, and somebody said, I think you're crazy. I said, why? He says, do you think the church can take care of all the poor in America? Our budget last year was $1.2 trillion. It's the federal budget. I said, yeah, why is that a problem? He goes, you think your church can raise $1.2 trillion? I said, no, we don't need to raise $1.3 trillion. If my calculations are correct, it's only about $200 billion or $250 billion that we have to raise because we're 5 to 6 times more efficient. He goes, ha, 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 so you think you can raise $250 billion? I said, yeah, because last year the church and Christians gave over $470 billion to charity. We just need to raise a little bit more, and we can cut our budget, the national budget, by 30%. And it would be one thing if it worked, but charity welfare doesn't work. For the last 50, 70 years, nothing has changed. Let me start wrapping up here. What is the job of politicians? I know, I've heard them all. But really, the job of politicians is to make laws. But why do they make laws? If you go out here and you see a stop sign, why is that stop sign there? Is it because somebody didn't want you to have fun? No, the stop sign is there to protect us, right? So in the same way, when God gave us those laws, He gave those laws to protect us. And if we don't follow those laws, then we will get hurt. But what happens if our legislators, our laws of our nation, violate God's laws? The more we follow God's laws, the happier, healthy, safer, mutually prosperous we'll be. But if we don't follow them, who suffers first? The poor, the widows, the orphans. It's unloving not to legislate God's laws. I want to talk about this because this is probably key. Many people say Jesus was not involved in politics because Jesus didn't he didn't vote. He didn't get involved in politics. He never talked to Caesar. He never got involved in Roman politics. Well, first of all, if Jesus didn't fight against Jews, doesn't mean that we should not do it. Jesus did not fight against slavery or racism either, but we're supposed to do that. But if Jesus did do something, then I think it indicates that we should do it. So let's see if Jesus got involved in politics. This idea that Jesus didn't get involved in politics is false and misunderstanding of history. Remember when we were governing Iraq? We didn't run their politics. They voted. They did all the things they did because there weren't enough of us to run their politics. The Romans had hundreds of nations under them. Do you think they could run the local politics of all nations? No, they let the nations have their own political system. And the Jews had a political system. In fact, could Jesus have voted if he wanted to? Well, yeah, because they had the very first representative democracy, where you democratically elected your representative. Remember that? Jesus voted for his representative. Probably voted a lot of times. Now, yeah, the people at the top were not people necessarily that were in there by normal elections. There were probably a lot of dealing in the back room like the rich young ruler was really rich. You wonder why. But who wrote the laws? If Jesus wanted to talk to the people who wrote his laws, who would be? If he wanted to legislate, he wanted to talk to his legislator, who would they be? Who was senators? Who were his legislators? And we see that it was the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was the supreme court and legislative body of ancient Israel. So if Jesus wanted to talk to his senators, who would he talk to? I hope you're about 30 seconds ahead of me. His senators, his representatives were called the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Wow. That means you can't even preach the gospel without saying what he said to the certain ruler named Nicodemus, Senator Nicodemus. You can't talk to him about when he talks to the Pharisees, but he was always nice to the Pharisees and Sadducees. He was always sweet to them. He would never condemn them and say, you dirty, rotten, whitewashed tombs, you pit of graves, you pit of vipers, who will save you from hell? Getting involved in the lawmaking process, civil disobedience, and the influence of lawmakers are modeled by us, for us, by Jesus. Jesus was involved in politics all the time. Now, I get this. I want to cover this really quickly. I get this. Well, Christians can't hold non-Christians responsible for Christian moral values. Well, I found this meme on Facebook. Well, when people say that, and when I've had this said to me, well, you can't force a Christian moral, I say, okay, so you think slavery is okay? No, it's not. Well, you think it is. No, I don't. Well, you do, because it was brought about by a man named William Wilberforce. He spent 40 years fighting slavery in England. Imagine if Wilberforce had said, if God wants to stop slavery, he'll do it. It's not for me to get politically involved. Just like the Israelites said, oh, if God wants Jericho walls to fall, then we don't need to march. Somebody said, well, I'm just going to pray for the elections. I'm like, what are you praying, that God bakes the ballot box? When somebody votes, he's going to change their vote? Is that what you're praying for? No, you got to get out there and vote yourself. You got to get there and be involved yourself. So if somebody ever says, now if you talk to somebody and you're at Thanksgiving or whatever, and somebody says they don't think they should be involved in politics, or pastors say it's not my job to be involved in politics, you should say that, Christians and the church and the pastors, if they're not involved in politics, you're saying that 8-year-old girls should be allowed to be forced into prostitution. If you say Christians should not be involved in politics, then you're saying gladiatorial combat, slavery, temple prostitution, and cruelty to prisoners should be illegal. How can I say that? Well, look at this list. It's just a partial list. Slavery, racism, segregation, child labor, gladiatorial combat, death games, infanticide, child marriage, killing twins superstitiously, throwing widows on their husband's funeral pyre. All these laws were changed by Christians who got involved in politics. And there are thousands more. How heartless, how wicked, how cruel can you be to say, I just want to preach the gospel? Let me tell you this. If somebody says, my job is just to preach the gospel, and trust me, I want to preach the gospel. But if somebody says, my job is just to preach the gospel, say, look, pastor, look, my friend, the gospel was preached for 200 years in two of the most Christian nations in the world, England and the United Kingdom. United States and United Kingdom. And slavery still continued. It wasn't until a man in England said, we got to stop this. Thomas Clarkson works with William Wilberforce, and he said, we have to stop this, that slavery was stopped in England. And it wasn't until a group of Christians got together and said, we have to stop slavery in America, and we got to start a new political party called the Republican Party, and that's why they founded the Republican Party, to stop slavery. How can you say the gospel is enough? How? You know what? Why don't you meet my black friend? Tell him that you just want to preach the gospel, and the gospel should only be preached, and nobody should have gotten involved in politics. It is your job. In fact, it's so much your job that even atheists should want Christians in politics. Why? Because even atheists don't think slavery, child labor, child marriage, and bride kidnapping should be illegal, because they've adopted our moral capital. Laws change hearts all the time. And let me finish with this one. See this guy? This is John Newton, who wrote the song Amazing Grace. He's the guy who convinced William Wilberforce to get involved to fight slavery. And they met at his church. Their church was the center of activism for them. Just like this church is the center for many things. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to show a short video here. Dad, you didn't know this. But I'm going to show a short video. I skipped it last time because we ran out of time. But I want to show this because the AV team was like, hey, you didn't show the video. So how many people watch Lord of the Rings? Great. So those of you who don't, this is a scene. Now, when they made Lord of the Rings, they made it. There were 3 movies. And then they said, oh, we'll take The Hobbit and make 3 movies out of it. But The Hobbit is a book this thin, right? Which is the prequel to Lord of the Rings. And so usually when Hollywood does something, I think it's stupid. But they actually did a great job on some of the scenes in Lord of the Rings. So this is a scene that's not in the book, but they added it, and I thought it was so poignant. So in this movie, you're going to see the elves. The elves are the people, almost like angels, or almost basically Christians, right? They live in these huge palaces and castles. They are the immortal beings. They've lived forever in the woods. One day, the orcs, the bad guys, show up, and they are battling with the dwarves and the hobbits. And we see this scene made up by Peter Jackson, and he talks about how the orcs and the goblins steal the prisoners, which are the hobbits and the dwarves, from the elves. And the elves say, we don't want to get involved. And we see the scene.
You cannot hunt 30 orcs on your own.
But I'm not on my own.
You knew I would come. The king is angry, Talia. For 600 years, my father has protected you, favored you. You defied his orders. You betrayed his trust. Danglonani, Negohenatha.
Uohenathan. Kidad wenithan uohenathanim. The king has never let Orcfield roam our lands, yet he would let this Orc pack cross our borders and kill our prisoners.
It is not our fight.
It is our fight. It will not end here. With every victory, this evil will grow. If your father has his way, we will do nothing. We will hide within our walls, live our lives away from the light, and let darkness descend. Are we not part of this world? Tell me, Merlon, when did we let evil become stronger than us?
Let me close with this. There are over 60 million evangelical Christians of voting age in America. Yet in most elections, only 20 million of us vote. That means 40 million of us don't vote. That means with our freedoms and liberties being lost, most of us are sitting on the sidelines. Now, I don't expect that of this church, but I expect of your friends and family. We can win this battle. This battle is ours to lose, but we are losing it now. We just get a quarter of those people sitting in the pews to get out and vote. We can change this nation. Look, I understand God is sovereign. But remember the children of Israel, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and many other nations? God held them all responsible for choosing their way into destruction. Will He do likewise for us? With our freedoms to be evangelized being taken away from us, will Americans lose the ability to witness? My friends, we just had the 4th of July. It took me 12 long years to earn the right to become a U.S. citizen. I've lived all over the world, and as an engineer, I traveled all over the world for my day job. And let me tell you, this is the greatest nation of all. But if we lose this battle here, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those with the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. The gospel is so important, that my first love is to teach apologetics. But I fear one day, like my father told me so many years ago, I may have to say to my son, son, we have to leave this country because I gave a Bible to a non-Christian. Why? Because it's illegal to give someone who's not a Christian a Bible in the United States of America. But my friend, just remember, I escaped to come here. But if we lose freedom here, there is no place to run to. This is the last stand on earth. Thank you very much.
Stand to your feet, church. This is a great word of challenge for all of us. I would like to just ask you if you've had any hesitation in believing that you're supposed to be involved in helping to stem the moral degeneration of America. I hope today you will just abandon every hesitation and realize that we all should do everything we can to keep the culture from going to hell. That should be the first concern of every Christian. So let's ask the Lord to help us to have the right attitude, to be bold. The Bible says the righteous are as bold as a lion. We don't have anything to fear. The Lord is our strength. To be here, we work for Him. If we go to heaven, it's all the better. So what's there to fear? Let's just do what we can. And let's pray that our state and our region and our nation will not end in the infamy of moral deterioration that we see going on now. Father, we just thank you for the message of Neil today that is a prophetic call to the body of Christ to stand up and do what we can, be salt and light, be involved in the school boards and the city councils and the county governments and the precincts and the state governments, whatever we can do, Lord, whatever our hand finds to do, let us do it with all our might. And Lord, I know some have more ability in areas than others, but Lord, everybody's got a part to play. And it's not so much for the part you play, that you play the part. Let everybody get involved to do what we can in this critical hour. And Father, we don't do it on our own strength, but we ask you, save our city, save our state, save our nation, God of heaven, and use us as instruments in your hand to do what we can do while you do what we cannot do. And for this, we trust you in Jesus' name. And everybody said amen. Amen. Let's give the Lord a hand for a great day and a great message. Thank you, Neil. The blessing, man. Africa and India to speak to us here.